Hey everybody, it's Miss Cole, and guess what? This is the last video in this series because I have finished this book! Yes! Anyway, so that means this series is coming to a close. It started because I've always felt like, as an English teacher, Pride and Prejudice was just one of those books that people are like, wait, you haven't read that already? But it's probably not the only one, and I'm curious what you think. Leave me a comment telling me what book, or books, plural, you would be surprised to hear that an actual real English teacher has not read. So, to recap, this is my reaction to my first time reading through Austen's well-known and beloved classic, Pride and Prejudice. While I'm familiar with the characters and the general plotline due to references to them and their influence on other works, I haven't seen any of the film adaptations either. This video covers Volume 3, Chapters 16 through 19. Previously in Pride and Prejudice. Lydia has married Mr. Wickham thanks to the intervention of Mr. Darcy. Jane is going to marry Mr. Bingley, and there are rumors going around that Elizabeth is going to marry Mr. Darcy, but she knows he doesn't care for her. Or so she thinks. Chapter 16. So, Mr. Bingley brings Mr. Darcy along to the Bennet's house. He suggests they all go for a walk, mostly because if he and Jane walk slowly enough, everybody else will let them have some time to themselves. We are told that Mrs. Bennet generally doesn't go for walks, and Mary can't spare time. Presumably she'd prefer to read or practice her music or some other way of improving herself. But interestingly, there's no mention of why Mr. Bennet doesn't go along. Anyway, it ends up being Kitty, Elizabeth, and Mr. Darcy, with Jane and Mr. Bingley trailing behind. Kitty wants to visit Charlotte's younger sister Maria, so they walk over to the Lucases' house. Kitty stays to spend time with Maria, and the others continue their walk, which means now that while Elizabeth isn't completely alone with Mr. Darcy, which would be improper, she does have the chance to talk more privately with him. She screws up her courage and admits she knows about his assistance with getting Mr. Wickham to marry Lydia after they'd run off together. They are polite back and forth, and then Mr. Darcy says that he still feels the same way about her that he did before. And he says that if she still feels the same way she did, he'll leave her alone. And then it is our narrator who becomes awkward, to wit, quote, Elizabeth, feeling all the more than common awkwardness and anxiety of his situation, now forced herself to speak, and immediately, though not very fluently, gave him to understand that her sentiments had undergone so material a change since the period to which he alluded as to make her receive with gratitude and pleasure his present assurances. Whew. Yeah, that's one sentence. Interestingly, the next part of their conversation is not given directly, but merely exposited through the narration. I guess it's important for fictional characters to have their privacy? The dialogue continues, with the two of them discussing their earlier attitudes and behaviors. Mr. Darcy still doesn't apologize, although it is theoretically possible that he did during the time when the narrator glossed over their remarks to each other. He does say, or at least imply, that he deserved what she said against him, and that how he treated her, quote, merited the severest reproof. However, he qualifies that remark by also stating that, quote, your accusations were ill-founded, formed on mistaken premises. Or in other words, yes, you were incredibly unkind to me and you were wrong about those awful things you said, but your error is understandable. Like, no, that's not an apology. Blah, blah, blah. They talk about the letter. Mr. Darcy interestingly says that he thought himself, quote, perfectly calm and cool when he'd written it. But that in looking back, he kind of thinks it was spiteful and bitter. I can definitely imagine him having a very quiet fit of self-righteous indignation as he scrawled that sucker out. But Elizabeth insists that the letter wasn't that bad, that, quote, the adieu is charity itself. They discuss Jane and Mr. Bingley, and Mr. Darcy says that he'd told Mr. Bingley, quote, all that had occurred to make my former interference in his affairs absurd and impertinent. I am consistently impressed by Mr. Darcy's verbal gymnastics. Like, he has yet to say, I was wrong, or I'm sorry, or I should not have said or done that. Anyway, they get back to the house, and that's the end of the chapter. Chapter 17. So everybody else is already there. And they ask Elizabeth where in the world she and Mr. Darcy were walking, since they apparently got back noticeably later than the others. But she just says they weren't really paying attention to where they were going, and it took them a while to return, and nobody thinks anything more of it. Elizabeth is worried about what the rest of the family will think about her acceptance of Mr. Darcy's proposal, since Jane's the only one who likes him. And that's not saying much, as St. Jane is incredibly reluctant to think poorly of anybody. That night, she tells Jane, who is not only surprised but confused, until Jane decides that Elizabeth must be pranking her. She says, I know how much you dislike him. And of course, Elizabeth was quite open about her loathing and kept the changes in her feeling to herself. Amusingly, Elizabeth says, perhaps I did not always love him so well as I do now. Oh, please. I guess not at all definitely counts as not so well as now, but that's a really poor description of the situation. Blah, 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 conversation between them. Why do we get this when we don't get the actual proposal? Jeez! Anyway, Jane finally accepts what Elizabeth is saying, asks why Elizabeth never said anything about her feelings changing, and Elizabeth finally opens up about everything, which we are told takes, quote, half the night. The next day, Mr. Bingley comes over again, bringing Mr. Darcy along again, and we have a bit of comedy when Mrs. Bennet says, as she sees them coming, Lizzie, you must walk out with him again, that he may not be in Bingley's way. Yeah, such a sacrifice. And then a little more when Elizabeth goes upstairs to get ready, and her mother follows her, saying, I am quite sorry, Lizzie, that you should be forced to have that disagreeable man all to yourself. But I hope you will not mind it. It is all for Jane's sake, you know. Oh yes, mother dear, just for Jane's sake. Anyway, as they walk along, they decide that Mr. Darcy will make an official request to Mr. Bennet that evening, and Elizabeth will do the same for her mother. However, they don't do so at the same time. I guess everybody's in the parlor, or the study, or wherever they go after dinner. Anyway, Mr. Bennet heads off on his own to the library, as he often does, and a few minutes later, Mr. Darcy goes after him. Nobody seems to remark on this. I guess maybe they think he's going to the loo. But Elizabeth just hangs out in the room with everybody else. Eventually, Mr. Darcy comes back and he's smiling, so she's relieved on that account, and he lets her know that her father wants to talk to her. And it's pretty much the same thing as with Jane. Are you out of your mind? You hate that man. Are you just doing it for the money? But now that Jane's nabbed Mr. Bingley, we don't have to worry about that. Oh, fun quote from Dad. I know your disposition, Lizzie. I know that you could be neither happy nor respectable unless you truly esteemed your husband, unless you looked up to him as a superior. Wow. Hey! And then he continues. Your lively talents would place you in the greatest danger in an unequal marriage. I mean, sign of the times, but just yikes. Looking up to your husband as a superior is apparently a sign of equality? Okay. Sign of the times or not? How is that remotely logical? No. And it doesn't come across that the author wants us to roll our eyes at Dad in this scene either. Don't get me wrong, our society is far from perfect in terms of its attitudes about gender and gender roles, but let's take a moment to consider how much worse it's been and to breathe. Breathe. Okay, I gotta be almost done with the chapter, right? 2 more pages. Phooey. More blah blah. She tells Dad about Mr. Darcy's involvement with Lydia's wedding. I hope Mr. Darcy is okay with her telling the whole doggone family because Elizabeth has not been holding back. Anyway, next she goes to talk to Mom, who is rendered speechless by the news. Ha ha! It's funny, see, because she talks a lot. Oh, and then she asks what Mr. Darcy likes to eat so that she can make sure to have that for dinner the next day, which Elizabeth takes as a sign of her obsequiousness. However, We are informed that Mrs. Bennet luckily stood in such awe of Mr. Darcy that she barely says anything to him, which is, of course, much more ladylike. Chapter 18. Ugh. Halfway done with the section. And then that's it. Two more chapters. Honestly, he's proposed. Just get them married and be done with this stupid thing. Oh, seriously, Elizabeth is really using the "you liked me because I wasn't like other girls" bit. I don't know if I can make it, you guys. I don't know. I take it back. I'm glad I didn't get the proposal because it's so much worse when they talk to each other. It's awful. Elizabeth keeps making excuses for Mr. Darcy, and so when he points out that she's being unreasonable, of course, he's right. It just shows how great he is. Ugh. Anyway, they go back to the house and write to their aunts. Mr. Darcy to Lady Catherine, Elizabeth to Mrs. Gardiner. Apparently she hadn't written back after getting the news about Lydia's wedding. Oh, and Mr. Bennet writes to Mr. Collins, informing him. So I guess the Phillipses are the only relatives who haven't been told yet. And then, apparently, Mr. Bingley has written to his sister, or his sisters, though we only hear of Miss Bingley replying, not Mrs. Hurst, his married sister. And also Mr. Darcy has written to his sister as well. So lots of letter writing, though only Elizabeth's and her father's are included in the text. Thank goodness. And then the Collinses visit the Lucases, and Elizabeth is glad to get to visit with Charlotte, though it's so terrible that Mr. Darcy has to put up with the apparent near groveling from Mr. Collins and Sir William Lucas. And then Mrs. Phillips behaves much the same way, though I have no idea how she's gotten into the story at this point. Whatever. I'm done with the chapter. Last one, you guys. Chapter 19. This is it. This is the end. Apparently there was a double wedding, and it looks like this chapter is going to be a what happened to all of them. Mr. Bennet visits Pemberley on a regular basis, though apparently Mrs. Bennet stays home and Mary stays with her. I don't know why Mrs. Bennet never goes anywhere. We know why Mr. Bennet never goes anywhere, because he likes to stay in his library with his books and not talk to people. But Mrs. Bennet seems to be pretty social, but she never leaves the house. I don't really understand why. Mr. Bingley eventually does buy an estate of his own. Remember, he was just renting Netherfield. And huzzah, it's near Pemberley, which probably influenced the choice. Kitty spends a lot of time, quote, with her two elder sisters. It's not clear if it's with both of them at the same time or if she just kind of bounces back and forth. I really don't care much anyhow. Lydia writes to congratulate Elizabeth and to ask if Mr. Darcy could get a job for her husband at court. One that pays well, of course. She visits Pemberley from time to time when Mr. Wickham is away, as Mr. Darcy and Mr. Wickham still don't get along, and the two of them regularly stay with the Bingleys for longer than they are welcome. Miss Bingley is still sore that Mr. Darcy picked Elizabeth over her, but she wants to visit Pemberley and likes Georgiana Darcy, and so she at least pretends to be civil to Elizabeth. We don't hear about how often she visits the Bingleys. And again, nothing whatsoever is said of Mrs. Hurst. Lady Catherine is very upset at Mr. Darcy's choice. Her reply to his letter uses, quote, language so very abusive, especially of Elizabeth, that for some time all intercourse was at an end. But Elizabeth helps him get over it, and eventually even Lady Catherine comes to visit. The Gardiners also visit regularly, and the Darcys are always glad to see them, because they think of Elizabeth's aunt and uncle as the ones who brought them together, by having her come with them on their vacation. Never mind that they met before that, and Darcy had already started developing feelings for her, but it's over. That's how it ends, so I'm just going to stop there. I may follow up with a review/retrospective, looking back at what I had said throughout, and what I think about the book as a whole now that I finished it. But I might not. Right now, I'm done, you guys. I am so done. Oh, I'm done. I am so done. I'm always looking for book recommendations and interesting reviews. Find me on Goodreads at the link down below in the description. Now that this sucker is done. I'm going back to the rest of my TBR, but I'm curious to know, again, what book or books plural would you be surprised to hear that an actual real English teacher has not read? Let me know down in the comments. And also, if you stuck with me this long, you may as well join me on every other Friday for Read Away, hosted by honest-to-goodness professional YouTuber Steve Shives. If you're watching this when it airs, that means that tomorrow is going to be the 4th chapter of The Other Westmore. Even if you haven't read any of it, you are so welcome to come and ask us questions and join the discussion. We've got awesome folks in the chat for our live stream, and we just have a great time talking about the book. So, thank you so much for putting up with all my whining and complaining throughout this book. I hope my complete frustration and misery was entertaining for you, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much. Bye for now.